Thank you very much, Joy, for all that, which I feel I don't deserve. And thank you to everyone for coming here tonight. I have a couple of sections to read. The first one is from the chapter that is on the trial itself, the trial of Christ. It opens, in fact, with a quotation from Tony Blair. And Joy was talking about a great leap, possibly, between Pilate and modern politicians, but modern politicians are still extremely intrigued by him. And this is what Britain's Prime Minister has to say. The intriguing thing about Pilate is the degree to which he tried to do the good thing rather than the bad. He commands our moral attention not because he was a bad man, but because he was so nearly a good man. One can imagine him agonizing, seeing that Jesus had done nothing wrong and wishing to release him. Just as easily, however, one can envisage Pilate's advisors telling him of the risks, warning him not to cause a riot or inflame Jewish opinion. It is a timeless parable of political life. It is possible to view Pilate as the archetypal politician, caught on the horns of an age-old political dilemma. We know he did wrong, yet his is the struggle between what is right and what is expedient that has occurred throughout history. The Munich Agreement of 1938 was a classic example of this, as were the debates surrounding the Great Reform Act of 1832 and the Corn Laws. And it is not always clear, even in retrospect, what is in truth right. Should we do what appears principled, or what is politically expedient? Do you apply a utilitarian test, or what is morally absolute? Now, there is the author of The Third Way speaking on Pilate. So now begins the chapter on the trial. It was dark when he awoke. At the first cockcrow, at that time of year, the moon was often up and shining. At the second cockcrow, the Galecinium, night still hung in the silent trees. It must have been around 4 in the morning. A servant roused him, lighting the fire and opening the shutters to reveal the pale beginnings of the sunrise. The 3rd Legion in Syria had once adopted the local practice of saluting the rising sun. It had brought them luck in battle. The Acta Pilati imagined that Pilate too would have saluted it. Later that day, this account had him washing his hands before the sun, the god of purification. Most later writers like to think that he ignored it, eyes screwed up, head aching from the fun of the night before, and that it was in this state, hungover and resentful, that he embarked on the day that was to seal his place in history. In fact, it was not unconscionably early for him. Back in Rome, it was not unusual for clients to get up and dress in the dark in order to be the first to pay their morning respects to their patrons. Lawyers, too, started the court day at dawn, so that by 3 in the afternoon, the business day would be over. Horace, in one of his letters, rejoiced in this arrangement. At Rome, it was long a pleasure and a habit to be up at dawn with open door to set forth the law for clients. Others, to be sure, took a different view. Marshall wrote that one of the chief delights of going to the country was that the pale defendant will not break your sleep, and you can dream all through the morning. But Pilate's dreams had fled already, and the pale defendant was approaching. There was not much dressing to be done. He had probably slept in his undertunic, as was the custom in cold weather. His shoes were by the bed. A servant put them on him and laced them. This was the first essential. To walk around barefoot was slovenly, and the marble floor was cold. He splashed his face, washed his teeth, passed water in a brass pot held by a slave, made sure his nails were clean. His official tunic with its broad purple stripe, a stripe that still smelled vaguely of shellfish dye, was put on him. A fresh toga was placed over his head and carefully arranged on his shoulders. He drank, perhaps, one glass of water, chewed a piece of bread. If he felt his breath was bad, he could pop in a freshening pastille. In later years, Cosmos's was the recommended brand. Then, seated in a chair by the window, he gave himself over to the attentions of his barber. The light was still dim, too murky to see his stubble by, and perhaps too bad to read if he had wanted to try. Lamps would be lit to illuminate the scene. The razor scraped across his chin, his cheeks, the nape of his neck. Water dripped in the basin. A little aromatic oil was smoothed across his hair. All this was perfectly normal, routine. Yet it was not just another day in his life. There were perhaps 100,000 people in the city, 3 times the normal population, and he was in the midst of trouble. The judgments he had to make would be easy at one level, but vexed at another when he had to consider how the crowd would react. He was keeping order like a soldier, but he had to be careful like a politician, and he was not good at this. It was, to take one of the possible dates at random, the 6th before the calends of April. This was not in itself inauspicious. The unlucky days were those that immediately followed the calends, the Ides or the Nones. These and some others would be marked in his calendar with the letter N as nefastus, unlawful. On those days in Rome, the courts would not open. Other days were partly lawful. On NP days, nefastus parte, the morning was unlawful, but if the gods were propitiated with sacrifice, the afternoon could be used for court business. On EN days, endoterizi, hearings were allowed in the middle of the day. There remained the days like this one that were reminders of previous troubles. It is probable that the dates around Passover were already marked in his calendar with the special dots or seals proclaiming them unlucky, auspicio malo. At such times, even an unsuperstitious man might start to look for auguries and signs. The wavering flight of birds, water spilled on a table, the left shoe put on unluckily before the right in the dark. If a man of great power were about to appear, palm trees would spring from cracks in the paving stones, put out suckers, and draw wild pigeons to nest in their branches. Yellowing sprays of ilex or laurel suddenly revived. Eagles perched on the roofs of houses or were seen flying where they had never ventured before. They fought with crows and defeated them. Some even swooped down to take food, as one had snatched a piece of bread from Augustus while he dined in a wood at the 4th milestone on the Campanian road. After soaring to a prodigious height, it dived down again and returned it to him. Before the fall of Sejanus, crows had flocked around him and cawed as he took the auspices, and a weasel had darted through the crowd outside his house. Perhaps omens of this sort had already been spotted in Jerusalem, and Pilate, too busy, had missed them. Even good omens had to be received correctly. A sneeze had to be greeted with salve, good health. Tiberius insisted on this even when out in his carriage. A sputtering lamp had to be calmed with a few careful drops of wine. An empty eggshell pierced or crushed as soon as the egg had been eaten. A bad omen, even one as slight as a misformed cloud, a dropped glass, a horse stumbling, called for certain precautions. To ensure your physical safety, you could touch your hand to your heart, murmuring, "Salvum sit quod tango, may what I touch be safe." You could rebuff the evil omens by saying, "Longe a nobis," be far from us. Sprinkle wine under the table or change the rings on your right hand. If you were at dinner, you could kiss the table. At home, you could kiss the shrine of the household gods, wishing all the while for the horror to stay away. He would touch the altar as he prayed, or lift his arms, palms upward. The burning grains of incense crackled in a bowl. Servants, or children if he had any, might deck the little statues with flowers clumsily knotted together. He could give an extra touch to Apollo, the god of good luck, and perhaps all that would be enough to keep him safe. So that's Pilate going to the trial. Do we have time for another section of... let's see. Okay. I read a section now which is about, as Joy was saying, about Jesus as the rebel and the man who is without any power, or appears to be without power, compared to Pilate. There was nothing physically impressive about Jesus. He was, as Isaiah had prophesied, without beauty, without majesty, with no looks to attract our eyes, a thing despised and rejected by men. People took no account of him. As he himself explained to Pilate, he had no servants or officers. His kingdom had none of the accoutrements of power that Pilate would have thought essential. Yet Pilate's authority, like his medieval beauty, was skin deep. It was all violence, noise, and show. 19th century popularizers reveled in the scene of their confrontation. When they described it in words, they stressed the elements of equivocation and uncertainty. But when they painted it, as they did endlessly, filling Pilate's palace with grieving women with the faces of Rossetti angels, what was paramount was the clash of authority. In these paintings, Jesus is imbued with a faint and almost imagined nimbus of power, though his hands are bound and his feet are bare. Pilate, on the other hand, surrounded by marble, soldiers, and brass eagles, can't seem to connect. He makes the sweeping or contemptuous gestures of a man of power, but the observer knows they will not work. The governor is in the presence of a man of childlike subversiveness, who, as Oscar Wilde noted, is the first figure in history to have told his followers to live flower-like lives. And Pilate has no notion how to deal with that delicacy, that lack of substance. In the 20th century, Jesus was increasingly a separatist, a socialist, even a Marxist. And as he changed, so did Pilate, becoming every cynic or thug who faced him. No other age has been so convinced of the sheer brutishness of Pilate, a brutishness unmixed with majesty, physical charm, or even much intelligence. If Jesus was the Spanish Republican martyred by the sniper's bullet, Pilate was the local Falangist strongman. If Jesus was the worker priest promoting liberation theology's option for the poor, Pilate was the pinstriped caudillo with his mistress on his arm. The Pilate of the 1959 film Ben-Hur, presiding languidly and sneeringly over the famous chariot race, seemed closely modeled on the Hitler footage from the 1936 Olympics. And if Jesus was the Jew gassed in Auschwitz or shot in Treblinka, Pilate was his Ammon Goetz, the insomniac commandant, the reckless drinker, the man who went to the work of murder as calmly as a clerk goes to his office, and who thought that his exaltation after killing came because he had performed, quote, an act of political, racial, and moral justice. For even Goetz, in Thomas Keneally's words, had his moment of toying with restraint. The most heinous thug could be, in every sense, like Pilate. I think maybe we've... That's probably, shall I read a little bit more, or shall I take some more? Okay, I might read then, go on and read Keneally's quote about Ammon Goetz and his moment of hesitation before his killing, and then go on just a little further. So this is Keneally talking here from Schindler's List, or Schindler's Ark. It seemed that Goetz was attracted by the thought of moderation, a temptation worthy of an emperor. Ammon could imagine a sick slave on the trolleys or returning prisoner from Kabelwerk, staggering with that put-upon way one found so hard to tolerate, under a load of clothing or timber picked up at the prison gate. And the fantasy ran with a strange warmth in Ammon's belly that he could forgive that laggard, that pathetic actor. As Caligula might have been tempted to see himself as Caligula the Good, so the image of Ammon the Good exercised the commandant's imagination for a time. He would, in fact, always have a weakness for it. Tonight, his blood running golden with cognac, and nearly all the camp asleep beyond his steps. Ammon was definitely seduced by mercy more than by the fear of reprisal. So restraint allows the tyrant to avoid making martyrs. Martyrs know the truth, and by dying for it proclaim how strong it is. But if the tyrant toys with the truth, queries it, worries it, refuses to grant its importance and spares men the theatrical satisfaction of dying to uphold it, he remains the strong man, and they become the fools. Most modern dramatizations of Pilate show him taking this line. He is even the originator of this approach in history, the man of apparently assured and absolute power, attempting with a bit of a joke to jog Jesus out of his obsessive progress towards the cross. He does not always ask, what is truth? In Dennis Potter's play, Son of Man, he asks, aren't you afraid of the nails? Yet the burden of the question is always the same. Why do you want to do this ridiculous thing? Is it really worth it? The martyr will always answer yes. Only mercy can thwart his determination. Yet the practice of mercy can be painfully hard for the man whose first instinct is to crush the nuisance. Pilate learned that lesson right at the start of his tour in Judea. He had scarcely arrived when he found himself able to make martyrs, and at the same moment he felt humiliated and disarmed, because martyrdom was precisely what the Jews demanded of him. Right. I don't know how anybody has any questions. Yes.
Write this.
Did you get the question on the mic? Oh, yes.
How long does it take you to write this?
It took me about 9 months to write it, about 4 years to research it. But I was researching it as I wrote it as well. It took quite a long time because I have a full-time job, so it has to be fitted in little bits and pieces of time. Yeah.
Can you discuss the challenges of writing a biography about somebody whom we know very little?
It is exceedingly difficult to do. I had to go first of all to what little bits we do know, the historical sources. And there's only, besides the Gospels, which aren't particularly historical as we know, there's Josephus, a couple of chapters in that, one chapter in Philo of Alexandria, and then you get just a little bit of archaeological evidence for Pilate, one inscription and a few coins, which is so little to go on. But you have to go there first, really, to try to go to the real man before you can take off to the fantastical man. And the interesting thing about the historical accounts of Pilate, Josephus and Philo, is that, like the Gospels, they're full of psychological detail. There's only 1 or 2 incidents in them, but in each of them, you see Pilate in very close focus. And you can get the character coming out, this very prickly, difficult character who seems to be quite out of his depth in Judea, who doesn't understand the Jews at all, and thinks he's been sent to Judea to Romanize it, which in fact was not at all what the emperors wanted in Judea, because they realized the Jews had completely their own culture, and the best thing to do was to leave them to govern themselves, to keep their religion, and not to try and impose Roman ways. And Pilate is the first governor who really tries to impose Roman ways and comes a terrible cropper on many occasions. So you find, first of all, this character, as you look at him in detail, you get a lot out of that. So with this bit of a basis beneath you, then you can leap off and find what everybody has invented about him through the centuries and try to judge what they've made of him, whether or not it's fair or even plausible. And a lot of the later views of Pilate make him quite a tyrant, and I think there was that element in him of terrific sort of bad temper. I get the impression that he was very irritated with his job, that it wasn't a good posting to have. I mean, you were glad to be a governor, but you were not glad to be sent to Judea because it was so difficult. And he doesn't come over as an awfully intelligent man. He couldn't sort of try to negotiate with the Jews on their level. He only seemed to understand force. And if they didn't understand force, then he was humiliated by them, and he hated being humiliated, and he had to kind of go off and sulk about it. So, you know, you can manage to build up the character from the history a little bit, and you can see how that historical character has just been exaggerated through history to become something else, or in some cases rather softened in history to be made nicer than he was. You know, and that's another of the interesting things that's happened to him.
It just seems to me that the Gospels at least paint him as a very sympathetic character.
Yes, rather too sympathetic, I think. And of course, there's a political reason for doing that, which is that in the early church, it was important to get Rome on your side. And therefore, if you've got a Roman governor coming up against Jesus, you've got to make him sympathetic to some degree. It's important to have him wanting to release Jesus and to put the blame on the Jews. And I think they're too kind to him by quite a long way. I think he would not have wanted to release Jesus half so much or at all. What I do think maybe happened, which is in the trial, is you get a moment of hesitation where he's really not quite sure. And the reason I think that might have happened is that as soon as the Jews say he said he was the Son of God, that's something that would have worried a Roman a good deal, because people did say they were sons of the gods, and occasionally they were. And so you couldn't just dismiss it. And I think at that point, John says at that point he was really afraid. And I don't see any reason to think that that was wrong. I think he probably was really afraid. And at that point he takes Jesus aside and he says, you know, where are you from? By which he doesn't mean, you know, where are you from? Is it Galilee or Samaria? Because he knows he's from Galilee already. He means, are you from heaven? And as soon as Jesus doesn't answer him, so he doesn't help. And as soon as that happens, then Pilate's back to his own interests in the case, which are kind of keep his own job and keep the peace. But there's just that moment, which I think is the most fascinating moment in the whole confrontation, in the whole story, really, where you get these two cultures coming into contact, and there's just, I think, that moment of doubt in Pilate. But I don't believe he would have tried any further to spare Jesus. I think this is embroidery from, you know, from the Christian writers wanting to ingratiate themselves with Rome. You may have to.
I'm curious when and how your interest in Pilate came about.
Sorry, I'm just going to have I didn't really have an interest in him before I got the idea of writing something. It sounds strange. But I was just in church one day and it came into my head. I was just looking at the Station of the Cross on the wall, the first station, which is the trial of Jesus, and I suddenly thought, that is the most dramatic confrontation in history, that moment. Has anyone written about Pilate's side of things? And then I found, yes, a number of people had in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways. But before then, I don't think I had thought of, I hadn't been particularly interested in him, but in every year when we go through the liturgy and you hear again the trial, I guess like a lot of people, I felt sympathy for Pilate. You know, I thought, goodness me, this is a hard place he's in. And as I've just explained, I think we're made to feel too much sympathy for him, probably, but all the same, he seems a very modern character also. You know, he seems to be in the throes of a moral dilemma that we can understand still. An archetypal politician, if you like. You know, he's maybe trying to do the right thing, but he's also looking to the pollsters, if they were pollsters. I mean, he certainly would have had advisors around him telling him what to do, which is not an impression you get much from the gospel accounts. But every governor was surrounded by people telling him how to judge the situation, and he would have been. So you get this sense of a man who hasn't really aged. He's like a biblical character who is still very fresh and modern to us. So that was the interest, I think, as I went through.
Other than Pilate, is there anyone else who could be historically corroborated, apart from the Gospels, who was associated with the life of Jesus or that period?
Who's been historically corroborated?
By some other source?
I can't, well, I mean, apart from Peter and, you know, the disciples, I guess, who, you know, moved on later, but you mean the Romans who were associated with him, like the centurion, or you're thinking of...
Anyone mentioned in the Gospels who was mentioned somewhere else? There's corroborating evidence or historical...
I'm not sure that there is. I mean, there may be somebody here who can set me straight, who knows better, but it's kind of thinking back, kind of whizzing through it, speed reading it in my mind.
I mean, what do you think, Herod?
I mean, Herod would be,
Herod,
of course, yes.
Somebody who actually met Jesus and...
Who actually met him. As I say, opposed to Peter and people who were obviously, you know, went on and showed that by their writings that they had existed. I think it's probably only Pilate who is this, you know, is a Roman political figure who is substantiated in different ways, who meets Jesus. That's the interest, that you have this pagan world suddenly coming into contact, and you have a historical figure who can be authenticated. I mean, that's why he's important in the Creed, because the Creed is a very vague document. You know, it's all about God and light and words, and it's extremely abstract, and suddenly you've got one name, you've got a man, you can tie it to a date, you can tie it to between 26 and 36 AD, and it's something completely different. You know, it's important that he's there because he ties Jesus into history. And that's why the Creed is such an important document. It tells Christians, no, we didn't invent this man. He was crucified by this governor, and you can look this governor up, you know. So,
I think there's a couple other ways that you can read the account with Pilate and the crowd and Jesus.
Yes.
One, you can read it that he does not want to let Barabas go. Barabas is a revolutionary.
yeah, he shouldn't have let Barabas go.
And he's going to have trouble with him again if he releases him.
Yeah.
The other thing is when he says, "Behold, I give you your king." Maybe he's trying to entrap the Jews and be able to crucify more of them for sedition against Rome.
That's an interesting point. Yes, that's right. I mean, kingship is, the claim to kingship is what Jesus is accused of, really. I mean, this is maiestas. This is the crime of, being a king when the emperor's the only king that you should recognize. And I think you're absolutely right about Barabas. I mean, Barabas was in prison for murder and incitement to revolt, and it was not a man that Pilate should have let go, and he would have been in deep trouble with Tiberius for letting him go, and he was in deep trouble with Tiberius anyway, because he'd had a big run-in with the Jews. He had put up some shields to Tiberius in his palace that proclaimed Tiberius as a god, and the Jews had told him to take them down, and Pilate had refused, and the matter had gone to Tiberius in Rome, and Tiberius had ordered him to take the shields down in very intemperate language. I mean, he was obviously fed up to the back teeth with Pilate, I think, at this stage. And, this is one of the undercurrents of the trial, that Pilate is having difficulties in Rome. He's having difficulties with Tiberius. And, in fact, at the time, Tiberius is taking very strong measures against the people who've got Pilate his job. So, it's awkward. And I think he doesn't want the crowd to let Barabbas go. That's true. Whether it's the same as wanting them to let Jesus go, I don't know. But it was I think, a weird thing anyway, to turn the trial over to the crowd like that and say Jesus or Barabbas. I mean, this was not what a Roman governor ought to do. He should have just laid down the law and said, right, I release this man. But we get all this wavering. I don't know whether it's historical or not. I mean, sometimes governors did grant amnesties, but this idea of suddenly handing his authority over to the Jewish crowd seems to me not to ring true. So, don't know.
What happened to Pilate?
Well, he got into trouble again, and he is, a difficult man, I think, not a very good governor, but there was a revolt in Samaria, and he put it down with a certain amount of violence. I mean, and not as bad as it could have been, I think. He only crucified the ringleaders, which is fairly mild by Roman standards, but the Samaritans complained to Rome, and he was recalled by Tiberius, and called back to Rome to answer to charges against him. He went back to Rome, but rather interestingly, by the time he got there, it took about 6 weeks to get back, at least, I think probably nearer 3 months. Tiberius had died. And so he got back to find the whole city is in a different mood, and Caligula was actually the emperor, and Caligula later became a most extraordinary perverted emperor. At the beginning, he was quite a good one. But I don't know what happened to the charges against Pilate. They were perhaps moot because Tiberius was dead. But at any rate, he'd been recalled, so he was in disgrace. And it is assumed that he killed himself. I mean, that's what a lot of people assume, because governors who'd been recalled and were in disgrace very often did it. I mean, it was better for your family if you killed yourself rather than allowed action to be taken against them when you were banished. So generally people did this, and it was not seen as a bad thing to do at all. There was no moral stigma attached to suicide. It was thought of a rather honorable death. And I think it's quite likely that that's what he did. Or else was sent into exile, perhaps. And the European legends are all based on the fact that a lot of Europeans think that Pilate was sent into exile in the Alps. And that's where his ghost is still frequently encountered. Yeah.
What's your opinion about Bulgakov's interpretation of these events?
I think it's terrific. I think his Pilate is absolutely wonderful. And he paints him as he's such a tormented figure. And I think rather he's sympathetic and tormented. And it was one of the reasons that inspired me to write the book, in fact, that a modern political writer could find such an interest in Pilate. Yes, I think he's very good. I'm trying to think. It's a little bit faint in my mind now, the story. But there's that wonderful moment where Pilate has this blinding headache all the time and can't concentrate on Jesus at all. And Jesus then cures him. And he's quite sort of taken aback by this. He can't think how to deal with him as a result of this manifestation. And as I say, I do think there was this worry in Pilate about Jesus, about what powers he might have. And the Romans were an incredibly superstitious people, and any sign of healing, there had to be a reason for healing. If you couldn't work out how it had happened, you were really bothered by it as a Roman. There had to be a practical explanation. They were not inclined to believe in miracles at all. And along the same lines, I think it's very interesting to speculate what Pilate would have made of the resurrection, because one of the great gaps is that there's no Roman reaction to the resurrection at all. This seems to me very odd. Why wasn't there? If Jesus did rise from the dead, this is such a slap in the face for Pilate. He's been through all this, and he's crucified him, and at last he's managed to quieten this man down. And then, lo and behold, he's risen and he's out of the tomb, although you've guarded the tomb, and he's got past it all. But there's no, in none of the Christian Gospels is there any reaction from Pilate. There are falsified Gospels later that have a big reaction from Pilate, because when medieval people read the Gospels at this point, they didn't think they were very plausible. So they had to invent a reaction from Pilate, which, as you imagine, is sheer blind fury that this has happened. And, but I think it's worth, it's worth wondering why there is no apparent response to this, and whether he just gives up and goes home, or what it means.
I mean, is it historically proven that Jesus proclaimed himself the king? I mean, is it in the Gospels or?
I think what they say is that he was said to have proclaimed himself a king, rather than that he actually did so. I'm sure yes, as I recall it, people wanted him to proclaim himself the Messiah, and he tried to resist it because he didn't want to be the leader of the Jewish national movement. And in fact, he doesn't sort of put himself as the head of that until he returns in the Acts of the Apostles. Then he seems to want to put himself at the head of some, revived Jewish nationalism, if you like, or restoration of Israel. But before he dies, there's not a sense that he is actually proclaiming himself as a king, but others are saying it of him. And that was more than enough for the Romans. I mean, kings were just not to be tolerated. And so, Pilate, as this gentleman said, puts this very cynical question to the crowd, behold your king, which means, behold this piece of rubbish, really, is how you have to interpret it. I mean, that's how Romans thought of kings. Is there one last? Fine.
He is claiming to be the Messiah. When he's using the term Son of God, it's a reference to a conversation between God and David, where he said, "The son of your body will build the temple and rule forever." And when he's using the term Son of Man, he's also claiming to be the Messiah, because in one of the prophets they use the term Son of Man. So he is using it.
So he
is saying it in those terms.
He's saying it in sort of coded language that everybody would understand.
Well, that Jews would understand.
Yes, that's right. I think maybe from a Roman point of view that wouldn't have been quite explicit enough. It would have been to the chief priest.
It wouldn't mean anything to Romans.
No, well, that was quite clever in that case.
Well, I mean, he's doing this all the time. When they show him the coin to try to entrap him,
yes.
And he says, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and render unto God. That means that the Jewish people and Israel belong to God.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's a totally throw the Romans out statement.
It is
but
a throw. Yes, you're
the
quite
Romans
right.
don't see this. Only
it's
the
a
Jews
heavily
would know.
political statement. You're right.
But in the same time,
and it goes right
on
over
the
Romans'
surface, it
heads.
looks like he's backed off.
It does. I agree with you. I think it's a very clever statement of his there, which in a way sort of would please both camps. And we would certainly make Pilate think this man is no trouble. In fact, it's almost saying the reverse. Yeah.